Recipe for a North American action film. Talk over each other. Everyone is boss, at least once. Everyone else, pussy. Be smug. That is, be godlike. Want your corpse on CNN? Eject male lead. Parachute him into the dark zone. Cut to black. Leg raining blood on red sand in Swat Valley. No man's land. Sharia law like a heat. Shrapnel wound. Bad. Choose some, all of the following. Downed hero A holds flashlight in mouth. B conducts own surgery. C fishes bullet out with incisors. D winces in bedroom voice. Producer C cuts in, muses, the CIA makes you dream of immortality. Here is forever in a severed below the knee tibialis anterior. Man in control of his own blood, his own death, and outmaneuvering of the odds. Producer G. Right, sure. It's called adrenaline. Have the plot snort a line. Flashback. Grant Arab villain terrifying levels of non-empathy. Came through the civil war in Kosovo. Plays by the rule of no rules. Speaks in grunt. Inflicts upon broken champion an orgiastic sequence of torture from deep down in the sub-dom impulses of Bible Belt unconsciousness. Make sure the hero endures, raising his bloody leg with a shy smile, like a submissive John asking for a boot. He's getting it bad, his gun skittering away. When relief finally comes, it's in the whine of a drone, the song of America, the song of Berserk, the soundtrack to Call of Duty, the hum of revenge salty on your lips, an airplane in your throat.
Hello, and welcome to What Kind of Man Are You? The podcast about men, masculinity, and our deep shame. Degan, are you proud or ashamed to be on this podcast?
I'm very proud. I'm very
Okay.
Yeah,
I,
that poem, Recipe for a North American Action Film. These are the tropes of a lot of action movies. The hero is shamed in some way often, and it's played out in stories for thousands of years. I was thinking of going over movies in my head about this. Do you remember Rambo, the first Rambo?
First Blood or
I,
Rambo?
I'm thinking the original one in sometime in the 80s.
So First Blood was the first movie.
Ah,
So Rambo was the sequel, and I haven't seen either of them.
okay, here's the scene I'm remembering. I think I snuck into the cinema when I was like, I don't know, 10 or 12 or something. But what I remember is Rambo, right? Sylvester Stallone, the warrior, American warrior, has been captured, I think, by the Vietnamese, by the
Right.
Viet Cong. And he is, talk about shame, he's literally up to his neck in manure or some
Oh,
disgusting substance. And he's chained or whatever. He's trapped here. And so you have this sense of him being like absolutely victimized, right? Absolutely
right.
shamed. And so he escapes, of course, and he is now going to show his revenge. Whatever happens, that sets him up as a character who has been shamed. And the dominant way to transform shame, certainly in action movies, is to beat the crap out of whoever shamed you. And he becomes, in a way, he goes from the shame to the kind of heroic. This poem plays with that idea.
I'm going to bring a little thesis. I would argue that shame is the primary motivator of men. I think about the quote that Margaret Atwood said, which is men are afraid that women will laugh at them, and women are afraid that men will kill them. And her point was different from what I take from her point was the latter, right? Like men are afraid of being embarrassed, women are afraid of dying. And I think that's a real important thing that she said. But
Mhm.
they're connected too. And a lot of men's violence comes from shame. And your analysis of Rambo indicates, like, literally, if you were to ask me, would you rather be humiliated or dead? I
Mm.
would find that a hard question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I find that kind of weird, but also very true.
Yeah. It's ancient too, right? If you think back to the times of Greece or times of Norse societies,
Right.
it was a death to be humiliated on the
Right.
battlefield. It literally was. You didn't gain entry to Valhalla without courage on the battlefield.
Right.
And in a way, I think that's remained.
That's
Yeah.
right. Honor, the central element of so many societies, all of the ones to think of. And its opposite, shame, is going to leave you literally out of eternity. So, though shame is perhaps may seem like a downer of a topic, I think it's a really important one that we have to talk to.
Yeah, and I do define it first. I'm doing a master's of fine arts in creative nonfiction and fiction. I had to write a paper on a subject last year, and I chose shame in literature and the transformation of shame.
Right.
And in the midst of that, I asked I asked a lot of people, "What is your definition of shame?" And I asked colleagues and therapist colleagues, and I asked about 8 of them, and only one of them had a clear definition of shame. The others all said, I know it when I see it. I know it when I feel it in a client or when someone, or when I feel it in myself, but they had a hard time defining it. I guess one thing I'd say first is to differentiate it from guilt. Guilt is when you do something to another person that you feel bad about. You lie about your age, or you tell your boss you're sick when you're not, or whatever. You feel certain levels of guilt. It's very much you feel it because of something you have done. But shame is really different. It's when someone or some outside force judges you publicly and says in one way, shape, or form, you are not good, right? You don't fit in. You are not one of us. And I want to make a distinction too. I think there's a societal shame around pride and heroism, which is for men in a general sense. And I also think there's chronic shame, someone who has been repeatedly shamed or ostracized in some way. But let me just say a couple of these definitions here. Salman Rushdie, his second novel is called Shame. And in it, he writes shame, a short word, but one containing encyclopedias of nuance. So here's a couple of these encyclopedia. Webster says painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. And then there's a modest or dishonorable conduct. So there we have honor again. But there's always got to be a shamer. There's always got to be someone who makes this, right? We don't shame ourselves.
We
Uh,
don't?
at least at the beginning.
Okay.
I think if we're shaming ourselves, it's because someone has done it first and we have that voice in our heads.
Right.
I think at the very beginning, we don't come out of our mother's womb and have the ability to shame ourselves. Someone has to say, there's something off with you to
Mm,
be able then to carry that.
right.
A couple more of these. Sylvan Tompkins is a researcher and a writer who has specialized in emotions and affects. And he calls shame a sickness of the soul. And there's something about that definition that really rings true. That sense when you're outside of society, or you feel like you don't have worth, or you've been witnessed and publicly judged for something. I
Mhm.
think that sickness of the soul, that feeling of like in your gut, oh my, I just want to disappear.
Right.
Yeah. So those are some of the definitions of shame I found.
Generally, what I hear is guilt is you've wronged someone and there may or may not be a need to make amends. You are guilty of something, whereas shame has more to do with not belonging and
Mhm.
you are not worthy. And what you said. But can we get clear on, I think about things like guilt trips when someone tries to make you feel guilty. Is that actually shame? If it's, I don't know, some sort of passive aggressive way of making you feel bad for not doing something that they want you to do, even though you haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah, that's interesting. A guilt trip. You don't visit me, let's say,
Yeah.
like a
Right.
maybe a classic case of a family member saying, the father saying, you never come around here. Don't be a stranger. But that's not saying, that's a behavior. That's saying you didn't act in a way I wanted you to. But it's very different than being ostracized by the person, being told that there's something profoundly wrong with them. Or at least it's a behavior.
Okay. So what I'm getting from what you're saying is a guilt trip is trying to elicit a sense of being guilty of something,
Yeah.
whereas shame is you suck, you don't belong.
Exactly. And it's a power move, right? Let's say, just to stay
Well, they're
with the
both
father
power
here,
moves.
both power moves for sure. I think shame is very kind of, I don't know. I always think it's like radioactive, like it burns, guilt pisses people off. I think be interesting to just say, okay, what does it actually feel like in the body when you're guilted or when you're shamed or when someone gives you a guilt
Right.
trip? But I think shame, these are examples from therapy, but there was a father who used to put down an empty plate in front of one of my clients, one of my students that I work with, and say, you get food when you lose weight. Yeah, like terrible things. And so there's this sense that person has acted so poorly, that there's something so off with them that they demean them in that way. That's an extreme example,
Right.
um, but versus, yeah, what that last example, you never come around much.
Right.
It's a
Says the guy who's being a good boy and visiting his mother right now.
exactly. My mother is in the other room and taking care of my twins, which is wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's safe to say that guilt can actually, if applied regularly and strongly enough, can lead to a sense of shame
Sure.
where,
Yes. Repeated guilt trips. Think about that churches or the history of Christianity, Judaism. There's a huge amount of guilt, a huge amount of guilt inherent on these.
oh, yeah, Christianity, original sin, like we're born into sin.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, one more thing I want to say. We can't not mention the Game of Thrones scene with the woman being walked naked through the town and everyone yelling shame at her.
Yeah.
And she deserved to be ashamed in that show. But I think
Mhm.
there's a real sense of, I guess a distinction I want to make is if you hurt somebody and you're guilty of hurting someone, there's a certain amount of shame you should feel for that. That's not really the topic we're trying to get at. The other shame is like being shamed, feeling like being walked through the town and having shame yelled at you, but you don't actually know what you did wrong or you didn't do anything wrong. Um,
mean, can I unpack that piece a little bit?
yeah,
Because
please.
I think Sylvan Tompkins, who I spoke about earlier, talks about shame not as it doesn't necessarily have inherently a negative quality to it. It's a force that actually can guide behavior in a civilization.
Okay.
In this case, that was Cersei, right? In the scene in Game
Right.
of
Yeah.
Thrones. And in that way, you can say, okay, in this scene, she transgressed this civilization, right? That the mores of this civilization. And it's very dramatic and intense. We talk about people being tarred and feathered in the past. These are very public examples of shame and shaming. If we flip that for a minute and say, look at a politician who says something outrageous, I'm sure no one's coming to mind here right now. Then,
Unfortunately, there's more than one coming to mind.
so then that idea of shaming, okay, it's also the ability to be able to say, can you, it's like a societal force saying, we think what you've done is wrong here. and we want to call you out on it in a public way. And the idea then that shamelessness is dangerous if you can't
Hmm.
actually feel it. If you
Hmm.
can't actually say, okay, like what I said there was really out of place, really hurtful, whatever it was, there's the danger there of being almost like completely cut off, right, from empathy.
Right. Yeah. But I will also say that public shaming like that can easily, and we can look at examples in our lives and our politics and our and social media right away, can easily turn toxic and become a pile on or become
Sure.
where instead of it being like someone said something wrong, shame on them, it becomes let's shame them to get them completely out of the public discourse.
Or tar and feather them with words.
Right.
In thinking about right now, the Democratic convention is on, and Kamala Harris is, of course, being nominated to run for president. And I was just reading through news sites last night, and on Fox, this is the third comment down. There was a comment where, oh, she, quoting here, spread her legs for Willie Brown. That's how she got to where she's going.
Yes.
Right. And that, and the other comments, she slept her way to the top from the beginning. So if you think about that, that's not, they're not trying to get her out of the discourse. They're trying to paint her literally as a whore. Right.
Right.
And that's an interesting piece. If we think about what we talk about women, we can compare to men's shame and women's shame because I think they're very different.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
in in Donald Trump's case, he celebrates publicly his lack of control and his grabbing women and sleeping with women and all that kind of
Right.
thing. And yet he really doesn't seem to be called on that by his supporters. But then we have someone attacking Kamala Harris for a relationship that was 20 years ago. Uh,
Yeah. And it was a relationship, right? Like she was dating him. It wasn't like some sort of raven move to advance her career.
Sure. But because the ground is set through religion to say a woman is a whore or she's an angel or she's the Virgin
Yes.
Mary, at least in that Christian sense, the foundation is set. So it's very easy to touch that and say
Right.
she's one or the other. Um,
Yeah. And it is a different topic because I think women are also motivated by shame, as you say, but in different ways. And there probably is a conversation to have on our podcast about men's shaming of women and the effect that has. But I think we'll stick to men's feelings of shame for this particular.
Sure. I'd say that just to contrast them, to
Oh yeah.
say in a way then, and we look at just this generic sense of shame. It's between how you appear, man or a woman. It's radically different. It's radically different to be
Yes.
in a women's body or a men's body. And women, it's very much this idea that you're pure or you're fallen, or on a lesser sense, your appearance matters so much. Uh,
Yes.
how you appear. Where men, it's your actions. How invulnerable are you? How in control are you? How tough
How
are you?
heroic and yeah.
Right. Yeah. I just want to make one other distinction for a moment. Oh,
Yeah.
no, so I cut you off. Go ahead, Chris.
No, I didn't have another point.
I just want to make another distinction between those societal or shaming pieces and chronic shame. And chronic shame, which I did experience for about 2.5 to 3 years, which I've talked about in other podcasts, feeling ostracized, being ostracized in large part between the ages of grade 4 and grade 6 and 7. That to me has a different feel to it because it's basically repeated. It's repeated
Right.
and repeated. And when shame comes to that level, that's where it erodes a sense of worth in a way that I think is very destructive. Shame is destructive, can be destructive in any way. But there's a number of characters from books and novels and nonfiction that detail what that kind of shame can do and the kind of eating away of this sense of worth can do to a boy or to a man. So,
Yeah. So there's accountability, right? Where you take an action, it's outside of our societal expectations. You're guilty of it and you feel shame about it. That's a nice little, that's how we would like it to be, right? You misbehave, you feel bad, you make amends and you move on. But with this chronic shame that you're describing, it's more, I am inherently made of badness. It feels to me like that must have a chemical effect on you. Like the way you see
Oh, yeah.
yourself actually is literally toxic on your body.
Yeah, it's interesting when I've worked with people with chronic shame, and I've experienced this myself. There's a time where people will actually feel incredibly nauseous as they begin to speak about all of the poison in a way that they've ingested. And
Right.
sometimes people will be physically sick. And so it's like both a metaphor and a reality that they're experiencing is you're throwing up something that has been so toxic for them.
Yeah. So I think we've introduced the idea. I think we've tried to make our distinctions and have an understanding. Why don't we take a break and then we can get into a little pop culture, some examples.
Sounds great.
Okay. Okay. Welcome back. We're talking about shame. And Degan, you were talking in the previous segment about how you experienced shame in childhood and chronic shame for what sounds like a very long time. You said 2.5 years, I think. I do want to talk about making boys feel accountable versus making boys feel ashamed. I'm going to go into pop culture quite a bit, I think, for this, but also personal experience. You and I have both talked about having been bullied as children and the impacts that's had on us. And I just remember early Simpsons episode and talking about Bart getting bullied and his father telling him the law of the schoolyard. I don't remember the actual quote, but it's essentially very, what's the word? I don't want to say Darwinian because that's not the right word, but it's the strong survive kind of thing. And sure. And the idea that if you can't win, kick him in the nuts, which I wish I'd thought of a few times in my public school years. But this idea of bullying, and I think about because Chris Rock, almost all of one of his Netflix specials talks about the importance of being bullied as a kid. And so it's this whole idea, and it's a very common idea that you need to toughen up, right? And what his idea was, and his whole thing, Chris Rock repeats things a lot, and he repeats, "We need bullies, man. We need bullies. The world needs bullies."
How else are we going to get toughened up without bullying?
Exactly. And he feels, and I don't disbelieve him. I'm sure it's a true thing for him that the bullies forced him to stand up for himself. And my guess is he thinks that those bullies were key to his success. And I have no doubt that's true. Now, I don't think that we can all be Chris Rock. And in fact, there's a lot, it's very easy to pull this argument apart. But the first thing I think about is this just an endless chain of bullying that we just do? Is that what we're supposed to do? Because did the bullies get a bully? Is that so each person takes their turn as a bully? Are you both? Um,
Just to say, most bullies are bullied, right? Most bullies have someone, usually a parent figure or an older brother or someone who's exercised power over them.
yeah, absolutely. I think so. I guess if you believe that cruelty and violence in childhood is valuable to help you face the world as an adult, then yeah, that's a good thing. I do not subscribe to that, as you can guess. And in fact, I think that for every person who got toughened up by their bully, there are people who live with chronic shame because of bullying. And chronic shame doesn't do anything good for anybody. And
No.
furthermore, bullying isn't like Nelson in behind the school pushing you into the mud or stealing your lunch money. That could be part of it. But the whole point of bullying is to make you feel bad so that the bully can add to their social capital, to add to their sense of self-worth. Not sure it works, but there's this idea that by taking you down, I am lifted up, right? My status goes up. I feel better about myself. I divert attention negative attention away from myself to someone else. And that doesn't just involve shoving someone into a locker. It doesn't just involve pushing someone into mud or stealing something from them. It also involves, I think of bullying as terrorism, man. My experience of bullying was chronic, daily, and based on abuse of my sister. And so my job was to protect my sister. I'm not complaining here. I'm just saying this is where I think I had a right to complain at the time, but I've
We're
gone
put in a
through,
very difficult situation.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm not saying this for people to feel bad for me. I'm saying this is straight up fact. For the same amount of time as you, I had to go to school every day
Yeah.
and face bullies on the way to school who would torment my sister, not just by violence was included, but also by utter shameful comments about her and me. And those sorts of things did not toughen me up. They made me weaker.
Yeah. I think the distinction is absolutely true between moments where someone plays with power and pushes you around, and then moments of being consistently, chronically bullied and shamed in front of
Yeah.
others. And what's interesting, when I told my story to a good friend of mine, actually, who was a year older than me, she became a principal in Northern Ontario in the town that we both grew up in. And she said, after hearing my experiences, she was a principal and then was teaching other teachers. And she instituted an anti-bullying policy because of what I shared with her. And so there is something, of course, to learning to stand up for yourself in one way, shape, or form. Thing about that, about whether it's language, whether it's your body. But there's another thing about the complete lack of observation by adults in an institution like a school that allows something like this to continue. And teachers are smart. You can walk into a classroom and know very quickly who has power and who is diminished or who's in trouble. There's no excuse for teachers who observe classrooms. And in that way, I think we have been failed, certainly in the 70s and 80s, and to a lesser extent now, but not always. I'm still working with people that have been bullied up to 5 years ago relentlessly. And the impact it has on their mental health is profound.
Yeah, I would add administrators and I would add policymakers into that because teachers are basically given an impossible task in their job. And so they're expected to teach our kids and manage behavior and deal with parents. And anyway, other thing I will say about bullying is bullies are clever. They're good at their roles and they love finding new ways to separate someone from the herd. And that's what bullying is about, as far as I'm concerned, is feeling, as you described it, as ostracized, right? Is feeling like you are unsafe, without support, and alone, right? So what they do, that's why the trope is always like behind the school, right? Because it's out of sight of teachers. It's out of sight of your friends and the adult support. Still is not an excuse for the adults in children's lives for not doing something about it. And I feel like we only in the last, 10 to 15 years even started acknowledging it as an issue. And it was mostly around gay straight alliances, right? Where schools were banning these things. And this is our first protection against bullying and
Yeah.
specifically bullying gay kids. But a nice start in the general acknowledgement of what bullying is and how having a group like a gay straight alliance can actually, I think it's documented that it can save lives, right?
Mhm.
It's really important for the adults, not just directly in kids' lives, but who have an influence over what happens in kids' lives to play a role and not get in the way of good solutions.
Mm. Let's talk about transforming shame. One of the most important pieces for me in school in those years was having friends. And you can transform shame after it happens, right? You can share with therapists, you can share with a friend or family and begin to feel like, yeah, okay, I was unfairly treated in that way.
Right.
What was really important to me, and what I honestly thank God for, is I had two particularly very close friends that just simply stood by me the whole way throughout those years. And there's something normalizing. There's something just so human. It's like I had a part of me that was absolutely human. That wasn't that didn't feel ostracized and alone and isolated. And I feel without them, I wouldn't be sitting here. I don't think I would be a therapist. I feel like a balanced whole individual, not perfect, but pretty damn good. And I thank those two people so much. What about you? What helped you come through, heal these years?
I would actually say the bullying was longer than the 2.5 years. The walk to school was like the sort of crystallization of all that. But my parents were at a loss as to know how to help me. I can look back and say, here's how you could have helped me. That's not useful to them. It might be useful if I give advice to parents today.
Yeah.
But they were at a loss and they always said, punch them in the nose. They'll get the message. And I knew at that young an age that violence begets violence. And I knew that if I was like, I've said this previous episodes, but I was a scrawny little kid. I think part of the reason I was picked on was because I was easy to beat up. And so this idea of punching someone in the nose comes from that whole approach to fighting bullying. And I think in some cases, I'm not saying that's not a good approach. I'm saying it's not a universal approach. Like
Mhm.
in certain cases where you throw someone off, it can really change the dynamic. And I think that's true. But that didn't work for me the one or two times I tried it, and it wasn't a solution for me. And even in friendships, because of I'm not trying to make my childhoods seem terrible, but just in the context of shame, a lot of this stuff does sound terrible. Because even the friendships I had all the way through even high school, there was a lot of cruelty in the way we talked to each other and a lot of shaming the other person for having uh, something wrong with your body. I was too skinny. Another friend of mine was too fat. And we would do it to each other. I wasn't innocent of this, right? And so, in terms of what changed, there were a couple things. In high school, I started to get a better sense of myself. I got a job outside of school where I met people who were like that, but I also met people who saw me differently from the whole narrative that I guess existed in my own head and in other people's heads about me. But I think really going away, leaving my hometown and going away to
Yes.
university, I was able to start again. And a good friend of mine who listens to this podcast, I met him in my first year of university. We're still friends now. And he gives great commentary on the podcast every episode. And so thank you, Neil. And I don't think that I suddenly became a perfect person, but I got to reinvent myself. I got to look again at how other people saw me. And that also enabled me to look at myself with a little distance as well. Because if once I got out of that soup of whatever school was for me in childhood and teenage years, and I saw how other people saw me, I could say, oh, there are different ways of looking at me. And it allowed me to have a sense of humor about myself, see that maybe something I was doing, because I could get moody and I could get, probably still can. I know I still can, but and I could get angry and sad, but with an opportunity to see myself through different sets of eyes, I was able to have a little more, what's the word? It was lighter. It was a less sort of being stuck in this idea of where I fit in and didn't fit in, and more of being just a whole person and seeing that I could belong and it didn't have to be in these crazy, cruel spaces that I seem to get involved in.
working with students often, their shame place is often the home place of trauma or their uh, place of just not feeling worthy. And so much of the work is literally that. How can you make your way out in the world on your own, away from this environment that even if you're reminded by friends, by support that you're good and whole, you go back into this house, this living room that you've been in for so long that is saturated with this sense of shame or abuse or whatever it is. And it's, so getting out of there is absolutely crucial. So you see yourself, you're in different walls around you, and that sense of who you can be.
Yeah. And it's as soon as you started talking like that, I got the Cheers theme song in my head. You want to be where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. And in that show, that character Norm, everybody shouted his name when he came in. And there was a weekend that you had for your birthday one year, and it was in the winter, and it was a guys' weekend, a bunch of your friends, and including me. And there was going to be a big snowstorm the next day, and I didn't want to drive home in that. I decided I was going to leave early. And one of your friends said to me, "Oh, it's too bad. It's too bad you're going." And I said, "Yeah, I know I'm a big chicken or whatever," being self-deprecating. And he's, "No, it's just you're a nice guy, and it's be nice to have you around." I said,
Right.
it it was such a small thing to say, but it really turned it upside down because I was feeling not a lot of shame, but I was a little embarrassed that I was the only one who seemed to be worried about driving in the snow. But he flipped it over and said, "No, we want you to stay because you belong here. We want you to be here."
It's interesting to think about being at a guy's weekend. It feels very different to be. That was my 40th and I think 41st birthday or something. I got us all
Something like
together,
that. Yeah.
and it feels very different when you're with a group of guys in that sense. It's almost, even though I don't engage in a lot of kind of hazing or poking all the time, when we're together, there's something that comes up in the air when there are a group of guys together that there's a little more. So it's almost like, to me, you were almost responding to this idea of a bunch of guys being together. Oh, you're going to go home early because it's going to snow. You
Yeah.
know, you're responding to unsaid words, but that can be part of male camaraderie.
Yeah. And I think you did it twice. And those 2 weekends redefined what a guy's weekend could be for me. Cause the first time you did it, I was like, I do not want to do this because my idea of a guy's weekend was going to be a bunch of guys getting together, talking about stupid bullshit. Right? Like,
Right.
and, and I don't know, maybe there was some talk about that, but it actually felt like a bunch of guys getting together, just doing things that guys want to do when they get together. We didn't do anything all that out of the ordinary. I think
We
uh,
rented the gym at a local high school.
now that was really fun. Yeah. We
They
played
had
some
the sport.
sports. We were, and you, that was really cool because we were all better at different sports and we played different sports. And we played some poker, I think, and some of you had instruments. So there was some music and
We
yeah,
had a barbecue. We totally did the man thing with our barbecue. I
sure.
remember enormous amounts of meat. Yeah.
Just amounts of meat. But I will say someone there was really good at presentation of food. And so our plates looked gorgeous.
Uh,
But there was also, yeah, there was beer and it was all of that. But there was very little locker room talk. That's right. Yeah. Talk of women was almost non existent, actually.
Make it sound like we're a bunch of monks.
Yeah, we were. No, I felt like we were having a blast, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
We were
yeah.
drinking beer, we were playing poker, we were playing music, we were playing sports. But
Glad,
like,
Chris. I'm really glad about that. I mean, think about shame. Like, if you think that when a lot of guys get together, there's a lot of one-upmanship, a lot of groups of guys. And I was just listening to someone talk about working on a construction site with a guy who had long hair. And when the guys regularly, jokingly, but are just like, "Hey, must be shitty to have to sit down when you pee."
Yeah.
Probably a girl,
like
you know.
there's something wrong with that.
yeah, but the constancy of it. And construction sites they're intense, right? They're intense for misogyny and just like everyday micro shaming or whatever. And it just, just something nice to think about guys coming together from your perspective. They're like, I hadn't thought of that birthday like that, but that we can just be, I know we
Yeah.
listen to music. I don't know. I'm sure we chatted about our partners or who we wanted to sleep with or whatever, but not in we're just not assholes. We're not being
Yeah.
derogatory.
And we weren't like, now, one thing I did notice is that your longer time friends, like friends from high school and that kind of thing, there was a dynamic there that I felt like I didn't fully understand. And sometimes there was some, I wouldn't say shaming, but some intensity that I didn't understand. And but it wasn't in general, I think we were like, it was respectful without being some sort of ritualistic monk's weekend, as you're saying.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. It was really quite fun.
I like this idea about how we heal shame in various ways and talked about friendship at the time or friendship afterwards on just that shame there, the almost like that societal shame can be healed simply by redefining, oh, just to go back, this idea that being with a group of guys where we don't have to one up the other all the time can heal this deep sense, these settled ideas about how guys should be together, how they, and in a way, like you could look at that sort of Greek battlefield in a way and say, but what's showing up in a construction site there? If you've got to say, it must suck to have to sit down and pee with
Yeah.
with long haired faggot, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like,
Multi-layered.
yeah,
What we've talked a lot about the inner journey and and therapy and all that sort of thing. And it's just nice to know that maybe just the guys' weekend that is respectful and committed to each other having fun rather than fighting for status and shaming other people
sure.
can be every bit as healing as your sort of deep inner journey and any sort of therapy you might get.
I mean, in that way, and I know I've talked a lot about that, the idea of healing in that therapy sense, but I think
Mm,
therapy is like a rehearsal for life. Like the big societal healing is literally going to be just how we are with each other, outside an office, out for sure. And so what do we bring in? Do we as men, how do we mentor other men? How do we call out men for being assholes? Talk about like bullying. The other side of that is we need strong, clear men that are going to say, you're out of line. I think that's where we end up really redefining this idea, like to, tear out the roots of that literally ancient kind of shame culture. And just to
yeah.
say how real that shame culture is and how much of a need there is to redefine it. There's a book I'm reading right now called Aggression, Time and Understanding by Frank M. Stamler. And in it, there's a talk of or a study that looks at when men have been incarcerated, short-term incarcerations, what the instigating factor was. The percentage is something like 90% of men that are in for violent acts were there because one was shamed by the
Mm,
other,
right.
whether, and so just to say how this culture is saturated in this still. And I was thinking about this for me, I can get caught in this too. I was
Sure.
bullied, and I think, and my way, just to say a couple of things about how I've responded in a way to being shamed. There were times where I became the bully more verbally. I was yeah, more verbally than physically. But it's just as destructive, if not more. So you use words like a
Right.
knife and just tone of voice and everything else. And I certainly had some friends that I could see weaknesses in. Like you said, bully can see a weakness. You can see it because you've been trained in it, because someone has,
Right.
has found yours. And so, yeah, I could smell it, and it could be vicious at times, which I feel guilty about, not ashamed. That's my actions on someone else. But just to say in the present, because you think about, we live in Toronto, and Toronto, as we know, as in terms of being a driver in Toronto, it's an insane city. If you
Yeah.
ever want to create a situation where you can see what shame can do and what heroic, but the hero shame kind of kind of dynamic, cut somebody off in Toronto and see what happens, or even just take 1 second at a light when it's turned green, and then you get the honk behind you. And there's
Right.
so much intensity in Toronto at the moment. But I was thinking myself, I have to remind myself if I'm feeling tired, if I'm feeling like I haven't had a great day, it's very easy for that old shamed part of me to come out. So when someone honks, I literally go into a fight mode, can give them the finger. And really, it's like, it's a honk, let it be. Just to say that sense of like how that chronic shame can come back.
Right.
Um, and how destructive it can be. And that's not, we don't, we don't all experience that sort of regular sense of shame. And as a man trying to be the one who's in control is enough. But if you add that to it, then we see just so much destructiveness.
I honestly believe that getting behind the wheel of a car or whatever changes you. And it's amazing how that thump is a trigger for that sense of self-worth, right? It can't be me who's in the wrong. It's got to be somebody else. And fascinated by that because even if you did do the wrong thing and someone honks at you, it's very easy to get enraged. I don't know. Probably goes back to the days of
Yeah,
chariots in Greece and
absolutely. I really like that we're moving toward this. I know joy is going to be our last one, which we should mention. And that we're talking about healing shame, transforming shame, how we can heal ourselves and be different, be outside of that evil way of being.
you brought it in with just the idea of friendship. And I literally had to redefine friendship because I didn't realize I would see depictions of friendship in pop culture and be like, that's not real, right? Like
Yeah.
where people really cared about each other.
Let's take a little break. We'll come back in a few minutes and wrap up the conversation. Okay, we're back.
Was there anything else you wanted to talk about around this? I had a quick comment about the hero's journey and
No, you do the comment about the hero's journey, and then I think we should talk about a little bit about joy.
so I just wanted to make a quick comment because a lot of what we've been talking about is culture and pop culture, and a lot of these ideas, a lot of popular culture is built on this idea of the hero's journey and this kind of Rambo idea where a single person goes and solves the problem. It's messy, it's violent, it's difficult, but they overcome it. And these days, I used to be more into that. These days, all I can think about is all these people are going to have post traumatic stress disorder. They're not solving anything. But I think the idea, when I think about the hero's journey as an older adult now, I think about it more as what we've talked about in previous episodes, that internal journey, which is in some ways the hardest one to do of all, to understand who you are. Is it Aristotle, Socrates, who said the unexamined life is an unlived one? Anyway, it's a Greek philosopher said that. And just thinking about the guys weekend we talked about, I feel like there's a role for the hero's journey. But I don't think it has to be a man's journey. It can be a woman's journey. And there are times when an individual has to go and save the day or whatever. But we could benefit from a lot more community, I think, and guys' weekends or clubs or these sorts of opportunities where that third space outside of the home and the job where you get together with people and people, it can be the Cheers bar or it can be your place of worship. It could be a social club or whatever. But I think that a lot of the future lies in us getting together and not shaming ourselves for our differences, but shaming each other for our differences, but celebrating difference and lifting each other up.
Totally. Okay, I got a joke.
Okay.
All right. A man wakes up in a hospital and he sees a doctor standing over him. The doctor says, I got bad news and I got good news. Bad news, you've been in an accident. and you've been castrated. The good news is that you are in the only hospital in Canada which does penis transplants. And the transplant has to be done quickly, like today, and you have to pay. Now, small penis costs $1,000, medium one costs $5,000, and we can get you a large one for just over $10,000. And the guy says, look, I got to talk to my wife before you go ahead. She's going to be affected by this. Fine, says the doc. Get her on the phone now, and we'll come back in a little while, and we'll get going with the op. Half an hour later, the doc returns. The guy says, we're going to get a new kitchen. All right. That's the
Oh
joke.
my God. I love that. So rather than, I would like to ask you, and
Sure.
I would like to set up the next episode.
Sure. Perfect. Let's do that.
I would like to also ask our listeners, our last episode, let's talk about joy. What's great about being a guy? What brings you joy as a man? And how do you find joy in your life from that perspective?
Love it. Love it. And I feel if we trace the trajectory of these podcasts this season, we began very intimately with our personal experiences, moved through love and friendship and the rest of it. And I know a lot of what I looked at was my bread and butter comes from therapy. That's my life. And I think what I feel at the door I've come out of is that was the interior life. It's wonderful stuff. Let's launch with joy into what we can do out in society, right? Well, how can we be out there beyond this office? What can we, so I'd be curious to talk to people, talk to you just about how we can be in the world and be our joyous, good selves.
And that'll be our last episode of season 1.
Sweet.
So again, looking forward to hearing about that. Great to talk to you as always, Degan. And
Absolutely. Great to talk to you. You got a question for me?
that was the question. What brings you joy? So bring that next week and
Bring that next week. Beautiful. Chris, we'll talk to you then.
Okay. See you next week. What Kind of Man Are You is hosted by Chris Garbutt and Degan Davis. Produced by Chris Garbutt at VQC Media. You can support us at buymeacoffee.com/Chris Garbutt. Music composed and performed by Degan Davis. You can buy Degan's book at brickbooks.ca. Thank you to all our supporters and listeners.